As of today, it has been almost 3 weeks since the U.S. captured and removed Nicolas Maduro from power in Venezuela. That's around 430 hours of a Venezuela freed, at least from Maduro. And the pace of forward progress since then has come at a lightning speed. Good afternoon, and welcome to those joining us in person or via my preferred TV channel, ACTV, for this incredibly timely conversation to unpack one of the priority items in this agenda: Venezuela's oil reserves, its energy infrastructure, and the role these play in global energy markets. I'm Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director here at the Adrian Arce Latin America Center. This event is part of the Adrian Arce Latin America Center's steady stream of Venezuela-focused programming and being held today in partnership with the Global Energy Center and my colleague Landon Durrence. I'm also pleased that joining us via video is Adrian Arce, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of our center. Since we launched our Venezuela work in the wave of massive protests back in the spring of 2017, our goal has remained the same: a Venezuela where the people have the right to choose their leaders and the opportunity to be freed from economic paralysis. Now we see an opportunity for Venezuela to rid itself of adverse foreign influence and to deepen its strategic relationship with the United States. Given the seismic moment we are in, I'm pleased to announce that today's event will be the first in our new Venezuela Forward series, which will consolidate all the Adrian Arce Latin America Center's efforts to further accelerate this mission. This is the biggest opening this century for Venezuela, and I invite all of you to be part of this moment with us. Today's conversation will move beyond the headlines and focus on the realities of what it takes to sustainably extract and refine Venezuelan crude and discuss what role Venezuelan oil can play realistically in global markets. There are still many questions that need to be answered in Venezuela's path to economic recovery, but in the next hour, you'll get a better sense and better understanding of some of the steps that need to be taken in this pivotal oil sector where Venezuela crucially sits atop the world's largest proven reserves. Today, these barrels represent the large momentum that Venezuela now has at its disposal to bolster investment and to begin to stabilize its fledgling economy. Here, the U.S. government is brokering the sale of millions of barrels of Venezuelan oil, with it being announced that Venezuela has received $300 million in proceeds from the first U.S. facilitated sale. At the same time, a new hydrocarbons law is being debated in the Venezuelan Assembly, just introduced today, so we will have information hot off the press about that hydrocarbons law, with the current framework long an impediment to investment. These events showcase the rapidly evolving dynamics. So I want to welcome our panelists, Luisa Palacios, Francisco Monaldi, David Goldwyn, Jack Barron, of course, my colleague and moderator of the second panel, Landon Durrence. We're going to kick off today's show with a conversation between me and Gustavo Garcia, and then my colleague Landon will moderate the panel. So to begin, I'd like to welcome Gustavo Garcia, who is a coordinator of opposition leader Maria Corina Machado's economic and multilateral engagement, to the stage to join me in a one-on-one conversation. Welcome, Gustavo. Thank you. So Gustavo, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a busy time. This is a particularly busy week for you. So for the audience, aside from coordinating Maria Corina Machado's economic team, Gustavo was the founder, first director actually, of the Independent Office of Economic and Financial Advisory of the Congress of Venezuela. He was also at the IDB for some time. You've worked as an economist at the IMF. Also professor in the fields of macroeconomics and public finances at the Institute of Graduate Studies, known as IESA, by its Spanish acronym in Caracas, Venezuela. So, Gustavo, if you could start by sharing with us that we're in this seismic moment these last few weeks, but you've been spending quite some time, a number of years, looking at what could be a potential economic recovery plan. So if you could start by giving a sense of the planning that you've undertaken, you've thought about over the last few years on economic recovery, and then specifically the role of the oil sector within that.
Sure. Thank you, Jason, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to share with you how we see, in my case, the economic situation and the program of Venezuela. Just to clarify, it was the Office of the Financial and Economic Advising of the former Congress before Chavez.
Before Chavez, exactly. This was exactly before 99. Yes.
Exactly. They closed the office, so they don't need economic and financial advisors to have support for analyzing laws and decrees and so on, and the annual budget and the long-term fiscal implication and so on. Was the equivalent of the Congressional Budget Office here in the U.S. After what happened in Venezuela in the last 26 years, but particularly what happened from 2016 and thereon, we have 3 years of three-digit inflation rate increasing, then 3 years of hyperinflation, and then 3 years more of three-digit inflation rate. So the country, with a very deep recession, the country was practically destroyed without having any war, any civil war or war with any other country. We lost 80% of the GDP, and we lost a quarter or a third of the population, depending what is the base of comparison. We lost particularly the most talented people and the people in the age of being economically productive. That was mostly of the people that left Venezuela. So our question is what we can do in order to recover growth in Venezuela substantially in order for recover the 80% of the GDP that we lost and be attractive enough to recover part of the labor force and the human capital that we lost. And that is a very highly demanding rate of growth if we want to do that. Just to give you a comparison, in 2013, before the decrease of oil prices and the dramatic decrease in oil production, our GDP was about $355 billion, okay? It is around $100 billion at this moment. So if we want to recover those $350 billion in US dollars, GDP, we need to grow for 15 years at a rate of growth of 10%. That is quite demanding. But we think Venezuela could reach that if we first reestablish the rule of law, very clear rules, and open the economy in all sectors where the public sector is not the most efficient in economic activity.
And Gustavo, I want to jump in here. So when you're looking at that, and just a quick follow, how have you, when you look at that kind of recovery, obviously for the U.S. and the president, the oil sector is absolutely fundamental. How have you looked at the potential of where the oil sector could play, given the sizable importance for Venezuela as part of that recovery?
Exactly. That target can be reached only because we have the oil sector in Venezuela. Even if we take the more conventional oil reserve, including the extra heavy oil, and that it could be economically exploitable according to the technology available, we have approximately $150 billion of oil reserve. That's one of the largest of the world, no question the largest in the Western Hemisphere, and we could mention maybe a little bit more according to how technology evolved. So Venezuela could reach a production in the next third year of about 4 million barrels per day. And that will be the main driving force of growth in Venezuela, because it's going to provide not only the foreign exchange needed, the fiscal resources for the public sector to be sustainable, and particularly because it will demand that investment in order to reach that production target will demand goods and services that will have a significant multiplier effect in the economy.
So, Gustavo, I'd like to get your thoughts. We're going to go on this more in the second panel, but we talk a little bit about the infrastructure.
Sure.
Right. There's been a lot of discussion about the necessary infrastructure, the degree to which the current infrastructure can be used, and the degree to which the new infrastructure. Can you give us a sense of what you see as a timeline for the expected period of investment for infrastructure, and also what do you see as infrastructure that can be used now to be able to facilitate that growth in the oil sector, and how much will have to be invested in new infrastructure to make the sector more viable?
Without including the refineries, according to many oil companies, particularly oil field service company, that infrastructure can be recovered in about 3 years, at most 4 years, in order for the country to be able to increase production significantly. So that's a very short period of time for any oil investment. If you go to a greenfield, you will need no less than 5 years of investment. In the case of the extra heavy oil, maybe a little bit more than 5 years. So maybe in Venezuela, you can increase production very rapidly because that infrastructure can be recovered without not a huge amount of investment in about 3 years. The problem is not in the oil sector, and that does not include the refineries. That's another element. But the main bottleneck is in the electricity sector, because in order to produce oil, you need to provide electricity.
Stable, efficient electricity.
Exactly, stable and continuous and maybe increasing electricity supply, and the electrical sector is in shambles. So the only way to be able to recover the economy in a few years will demand a significant financing program that only is going to be possible after more than 8 years defaulting in all type of debt. We need a significant amount of investment from the multilateral institution, starting with the IMF and extended fund facility of high access, similar amount of money from the World Bank, and also significant investment programs from the Indian Corporation and the Inter-American Development Bank.
And when you look at this, who is Venezuela competing with globally in oil markets?
Oh, very competitive. Despite that many people have mentioned that, I concluded in about a month ago a study with a group of oil engineering and another 2 colleagues, a very thorough evaluation of what is the break-even price of oil in Venezuela, including the extra heavy. Let me tell you something, that is $27 per barrel. And doing that, including the fiscal payment of royalty, yes, including the royalty, including the income tax, the corporate income tax, and including the whole investment for a period of 10 years, bringing in net present value. That is $27 per barrel. The only countries in the world that produce oil below that are the Arabic countries, because it's a very light oil and not that deep. Brazil, Guyana, Vaca Muerta, Permian oil, Canada are well above that. So we are very competitive. For a short period of investment, in order to recover the industry, at least during the first, let's say, 5-6 years, to give the oil production a significant jump, Venezuela is very competitive. Of course, solving the electricity problem.
So very, very competitive, and a couple more questions before we go to our panel. Very competitive, but also risks. And I want to ask you about what you're seeing as some of the most important risks to keep in mind when investing in the sector. I've heard, one of the risks is always, companies just being able to get paid, right, among other things. So explain a little bit.
It's a very good question. All the risks are above the ground, not below the ground, not in place in the oil field. All the risks are above the ground. Security, rule of law, okay? A much lower fiscal pressure on the oil sector because we have one of the highest royalty in the world and the highest income tax for the oil sector companies. So that has to be eliminated. And no discretionary power of the government to change the rule of the law, including the tax law. So I didn't have time to read completely the new hydrocarbon sector law, but many of the very few things that I read, because the law was published this morning, is that leaves room for significantly discretion to the government.
Yeah.
And we do not plan to do that. Even for the royalty, it has to be set according to a formula that is very well used in the oil world, which is called the R factor, that is related to the profitability of the oil field.
So, Gustavo, let me drill down a little bit more. So, as you mentioned, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in the panel as well, that the new hydrocarbon law was introduced today in the National Assembly, and while you haven't read the law in and of itself, but if you could share a little bit, in addition to what you just told the audience, what in your perspective needs to be part of the underlying framework that needs to be included to make the energy sector that much more attractive?
Okay. First of all, we have to reestablish in Venezuela, in general terms, the rule of law. Okay? Second, we have to have independent judicial system, but it will take many years for the people to believe in an independent judicial system. We need to resubscribe all agreements for investment protection in Venezuela, bilateral with different countries, like, for example, U.S. for the American companies, with the European countries, but also the multilateral agreements like CIADI, the Permanent Court of Arbitration related to the United Nations, the Paris Arbitration Court, and so on, the main three of them. But also, we need to include in contracts with private companies the wording of those agreements into the individual contracts. So the property rights are respected, reinforced with very clear rules. And of course, lower the fiscal pressure in the oil sector. Venezuela has such a huge amount of oil for maybe a window of about, let's say, 30, 50 years, maybe. So the only way that we can use oil to recover Venezuela is increasing the volume of production.
Yeah.
You can either collect the same amount of taxes by increasing the tax rate or by widening the tax base and have a lower fiscal pressure. And that's what we plan to do.
That's fantastic, Gustavo. And I want to move to the panel right now. I want to ask you just one last question before doing so, which is looking about a bit more macro beyond the oil sector specifically, but putting on your hat as far as coordinating the broader economic team. Debt restructuring. I'd like to get your final thoughts on an optimal scenario. What does debt restructuring look like to set Venezuela up for success?
Sure. I think it should be done in the context of a huge financial program with the multilateral institutions in order to be sure that any debt restructuring is within a framework to recover growth significantly in the next 15 or 20 years. Otherwise, my impression is that we face the risk of repeating the restructuring of Greek, by which they did 3 or 4 restructuring debt, and none of them was sustainable. Yeah. Even the last one was not subscribed by the IMF, because what many of the creditors want to do is to restructure debt before we have an agreement with the multilateral institution, because they think in that way they are going to have a haircut much lower otherwise. But the problem is that if that haircut is not good enough for fiscal sustainability and external sector sustainability, what is going to happen is the history of Greek. The markets are going to realize that that is not fiscally sustainable, and then in 3 or 4 years from now, Venezuela has to go again for another restructuring program. Excellent. That would be a mistake.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to please join me in thanking Gustavo Garcia for joining us in this initial conversation. And thank you, Gustavo, for all the work that you do and you continue to do. So pleasure to have you here. Before we begin the moderate panel portion, I'm going to ask you to turn your eyes to the screen as we have a switch on stage. This will be a short video featuring Landon about peanut butter, and it's not a video about crunchy versus creamy. So I'm going to say that, but it sets the scene for the discussion on Venezuelan oil. So thanks again, Gustavo, and please enjoy the video.
Okay, thank you.
Of Venezuela that is kind of important, not universally, but is a significant factor in terms of how we realize investment in Venezuela and actually produce the oil there, is about the crude quality. Crude is graded on a scale. One scale is about its weight. And the gravity of the crude can be a light crude, so you can have an iced tea, or it can be a heavier crude. And for point of illustration, you could have peanut butter. And that's one element. The sulfur levels also matter, and you can have a sour or a sweet crude. Low sulfur if it's sweet, sour if it's heavier with sulfur. And so those are the kind of factors that would go into investment and how companies think about the type of product they're producing and what eventually refinery they can send it to turn it into the products we use every day and pump into our cars. When it comes to Venezuela in particular, it's not so much light. This is the equivalent of being in the Permian Basin in the United States and having some of the light sweet crude that you see out in Texas. In Venezuela, and not universally, but a big portion of it's actually heavy. And so when you're looking at heavy, if you think about me trying to get this peanut butter out of the jar here into the glass, I can't do it naturally. I need something else. I need heat. I need force. I need pressure. And that's kind of the reality of how Venezuela has its heavy crude. It's a heavier crude that actually is very good for the U.S. Gulf Coast and the refineries that have the capacity to deal with really sophisticated products and different chemical processes to realize the value out of this murky, viscous product. Well, we were all surprised. By January 3rd when the U.S. government sent in military forces to take Maduro. I was surprised at how big peanut butter would play a role in my life. In 2026, I've received more text messages with the Peanut Man than I've expected, and I assure you we are not sponsored by Jif. I'm Landon Darrence. I'm the Vice President for Energy and Infrastructure here at the Atlantic Council, where I also have the pleasure of leading the Global Energy Center. And really excited for this discussion, and I think one of the most important conversations happening here in 2026. Thank you to Gustavo and Jason. Honestly, that was too short. I know you like punchy platforms here, Jason, but that was a great conversation. And to Gustavo, your honest assessment, the stark baseline in which Venezuela is starting for, but the optimistic and vast potential that you see in the country, and your passion for that is really inspirational. So I hope to see you back on the many events that we're going to have on the horizon here. We have a limited amount of time, and we know the issue we're tackling, and I'm joined here by a panel of experts who is quite remarkable, actually. And so I'd like to introduce those colleagues on the stage with me, along with one joining virtually. From left to right here, or from my left, I should say, David Goldwyn is the chair of the Atlantic Council Energy Advisory Group and is a non-resident senior fellow at both the Adrian Arsh Latin American Center and the Global Energy Center. Luisa Palacios is an adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia's CIPA Center for Global Energy Policy and former chairwoman of CITGO. What years was that, Luisa? I think it's important to have a sense of when that happened.
2019, 2021.
Big years in the Guaido conversation. I was in the White House at that time, and I recall those intimately. To her left is Jeff Barron. He's a senior economic advisor for energy market analysis at the American Petroleum Institute. And then joining virtually is Francisco Monaldi, who is director of the Latin American Energy Program at Rice University's Baker Institute. Francisco, thank you for joining us from Houston. I'd like everybody here to be reminded that there will be an opportunity for questions, both virtually and in the audience. For those who are watching online, we encourage you to submit your questions at Jason's favorite TV program, Ask AC, or ACTV, but it's askac.org for the questions, askac.org. For those that you're in person, we'll have a mic runner. With that, I just want to break into it. And I think what I'd like to do is turn virtually first. Francisco, you heard a little bit about Gustavo's framing here. What do you feel about the above ground, the economic and political situation that you think might be overlooked right now in the first 3 weeks of what we've seen happen since Maduro was captured?
Sure, thank you for the invitation. So I think there are elements, of course, of a rapidly changing situation that improve the above ground risk, but there are plenty that are still unresolved, let's put it that way. And as Gustavo said, it's very important to understand that in Venezuela, the issues are above ground, And if those issues are not resolved, you will only get the type of investment that is sort of short cycle investment in places that already have the infrastructure and that do not require these sort of long-term big infrastructure investments like the Orinoco Belt, the extra heavy. And so you will never get to the 4 million barrels per day that Gustavo mentioned without aligning a lot of other things. But there are a few things that, of course, have significantly changed pretty quickly. One is the fact that now the oil, instead of going to the black market to China, about 80% was before the last couple of weeks. Now it's going to go mostly to the US and probably other licensed destinies already. One cargo is going to Europe. Of course, that means less discounts. It means that it goes to the natural market for Venezuelan oil, that the US being very prominent among those markets. It also means that you can have diluents from the United States for the extra heavy oil. As you pointed out, Venezuela's oil, it does flow to the surface, at least in 6 to 8% recovery rates, but it doesn't flow afterwards. You need a diluent, naphtha or a light oil to move it. And so that has been a limitation for the Venezuelan oil industry. And this is going to be, of course, now much more improved with access to U.S. diluents. And of course, the fact that you're going to get expanded licenses to Chevron, to Morel and Prom, and to Repsol that already have the type of contracts that are apparently going to be approved in the Venezuelan National Assembly today, that will allow those companies to very quickly either resume or expand their investments. And you can see some barrels added there. But there are tons of other issues unresolved. One is you have the CPPs, which are the service/production sharing contracts. Those are going to be incorporated in the law now, but so far they have been given mostly to companies that are cronies or not adequate for these types of contracts. And so those, among many others, issues have to be resolved before the above ground risk actually get to a point in which these investments are really attractive for foreign investors.
I want to come back to the CPPs and the new oil law, or the potential oil law, a little bit later. CPPs being a broader term for new market entrants to Venezuela's oil sector. David, production sharing agreements. David, I want to come to you though and build out the other above ground risk and the other conversation here, which is the U.S. equation. I want to talk about what the United States objective is in Venezuela, and why the oil equation plays such a significant role.
Great, thanks, Landon. And I say I've subscribed to your TikTok channel now, and there's more to come than just peanut butter. Well, the Trump administration's goals for Venezuela have shifted over time. Prior to from the narco-terrorism objective initially, and then they stole our oil, which seemed to imply restitution for the nationalizations which took place. But that has now changed, and the president's stated goals are to control Venezuelan oil revenues indefinitely, to stabilize the economy, to deploy $100 billion of investment from U.S. companies with security guarantees to lower prices for U.S. consumers, and to raise Venezuelan production to levels never seen, presumably in excess of 3.5 million barrels a day. Some of that's been walked back. Secretary Wright has said, no, we're not talking about guaranteeing any U.S. investments, and he's lowered his expectations in the short term to basically 30% of existing production, or 180,000 barrels a day. I would say overall, and Secretary Rubio has talked about stabilization, recovery, transition with no timetable. So for the meantime, those seem to be the stated goals. I think a lot of those are probably not realistic. Controlling Venezuela's economy, especially if it restores production significantly, is an enormous job. And right now we don't really know whether there's a split between the U.S. and Venezuela for where those revenues go, whether they go with or without conditions, or how that capital is supposed to be deployed by Venezuela. So I think for the long run, that's a bigger job than the U.S. is likely to be able to take on. $100 billion in investment, probably not realistic over the next 10 or 15 years. We've already heard from Exxon and Conoco. Even Chevron has expressed, reservations about needing conditions on the ground to be much more stable before they put in money for new investment. And increasing production to beyond 3.5 million barrels a day really depends on, we're not going to do it at $60 oil, I would say, to put it shortly. But there is a lot that can be done, and this is what we haven't seen from the administration yet that we're waiting for. Sanctions haven't been changed or lifted. The interdiction still remains there. So if the administration wanted to debottleneck the system to get oil off of tankers and to sell it, they would be issuing at least specific licenses to companies that are there now to make it clear they can export. If they wanted to maximize revenue, they would say that any legitimate buyer could buy Venezuelan oil, not just the US, and that it would be sold at market prices. They wouldn't necessarily require intermediaries like Vital and Trafigura and allow parties, whether it's the Indians or the Chinese or anyone else, to buy directly. But we haven't seen those specific licenses. We haven't seen general licenses which would open it up more broadly. We haven't heard any conversations about debt swaps. And it's hard to imagine any significant recovery of the Venezuelan oil sector until the service companies that are owed billions of dollars, I would say, in aggregate, have a pathway to repayment. And I think the other creditors, including some of the current operators, have that. So I think it's a long stretch. I think today's news, and Luisa knows more about this, and Francisco, because they've read the law, but regularizing the Chevron model and the CPPs will help, because the short term for Venezuela is workovers of PDVSA's inventory. And that is, I think, as Gustavo said, it's not technically difficult. It doesn't require a huge amount of capital. With production sharing, it can be de-risked pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. So there is a pathway, but the U.S. has to give the signal with licenses that we're open for business. And that hasn't happened yet. And whether that's, you might know more, whether that's because of internal debate or uncertainty, or they want to figure out a way to screen who gets those licenses, not the current people who hold the CPPs, or most of them. We don't know, but we're a little bit stalled right now, and so it's hard to see that pathway forward.
Okay, I understand, and there is some opaqueness in terms of both the motivations and the long-term goals. We had to keep in mind we're not even fully 3 weeks into this. And I understand people are looking for, and I think the president has articulated a sense of expedience in terms of how the U.S. government's operating on this topic. And certainly here in Washington, I'm seeing that signal as well. But we just haven't seen the fruits of that signal come to fruition yet. Yeah. One thing that I think we do have a little bit more respect for, and Gustavo spoke about this prior to the panel, Luisa, the health of the Venezuelan oil industry broadly, and just what you feel the real state of affairs is for the sector, and what we can invest in that, and how we need to bring that up to speed the most quickly as possible.
Thank you, and I am delighted to be here with friends. So I think one of the questions to ask is, why is it that we are looking at oil as the anchor for Venezuela's recovery? And I think Gustavo really presented the right frame. You need to start with oil, and that means you need to increase oil production. Why? Because you need to increase oil revenues, because you need to start the economic recovery of the country. And so, and I think we should not lose sight of, at the end, this is a tool. It's a medium to achieve a goal, which is the economic recovery of the country. So what has been done until now, and I am going to use your frame, which is Secretary Rubio's frame, is stabilization. What did you need for stabilization? You needed an easing of at least an idea that some of the licenses are going to be expanded or given to different kinds of companies, and some minimum changes in the oil law. So that tells you that at least there are some aspects of the minimum requirements for oil stabilization to occur. But oil stabilization, to me, what does that mean? Let's just put some numbers. In my view, that means that that Venezuela, with all that we're seeing, could be heading back to 1.5 million barrels per day, which is where Venezuela was when the oil sanctions, right? And so that's what Venezuela was, ceteris paribus. It means the same kind of government with the same kind of PDVSA, with the same kind of financial issues, with the same 25% of the population that had left, with the same kind of economic destruction. So that obviously is not enough. But that gets you to stabilization. But you immediately have to start to think about recovery. You cannot just get there. But that means that you do have a different dynamic. Because in the first period of stabilization, you do have companies in the country that have spent quite some time there losing money. And so the incentives of these companies is to maximize production and get their production back to full capacity. So in my view, this is simply increasing capacity utilization in the current oil industry to where Venezuela's maximum capacity is at the moment. But as Gustavo had mentioned, very quickly, once we get to 1.5 or a little bit above, we might start to deal with infrastructure issues. Because you are not going to get to the 3 or the 4 million barrels per day until you fix everything around it. And so to me, the stabilization phase is about just increasing capacity utilization. That is not major CapEx type of investment. Those are OpEx type of things, like you were saying, workovers. So this is doable. I think this is something that we can realistically see, particularly because, as Francisco was saying, this has to do with the dynamic of the diluent situation in Venezuela, which, let's remind ourselves why that happened. We did have upgrading facilities. So talking about refineries, you have the refinery system in Venezuela producing at 20% capacity. But the upgraders, the most important part of the dynamics of why we got into this diluent situation, is because the upgraders are also probably at 10 or 20, if anything, of upgrading capacity. So we lost our ability to produce synthetic crude oil, so we now need to import diluents. That was not the case before. That was also something that increases the cost of production.
Right.
So in order to understand where we're going, we need to move from stabilization to recovery, and recovery means a lot of different things that have to do with the list of issues of rule of law, of visibility. You can do a lot with just increasing capacity utilization to monetize existing assets. But at the moment where you actually have to commit much more capital, you need to have visibility much more than 1 year. You need to understand where this is going to be able to assess risk. Because the problem is, yes, a lot of these oil companies operate in very risky environments. So at this moment, you cannot even assess the risk because you have no visibility about what you're dealing with. And so I think a lot needs to happen in terms of understanding where this is going, where the governance is going, where the politics is going, before you can actually commit significant amounts of capital.
It's not uncomplicated, but you lay out a really good cadence to the future of Venezuela's energy sector, and then for the economy, stabilization, recovery, and then full potential. And I think that there's a presumption sometimes when we get this scale of expertise on energy, and in particular on Venezuela on the stage, that we overlook that not everybody's tracking it as closely. And Jeff, I want to bring you in, and I'm glad I didn't wear my API socks today, because we'd be matching. But I think, we've hit around this a couple times, Jeff. We've talked about 4 million barrels, 3.5 million barrels, 1.2 million barrels. Where's Venezuela at as a baseline? What is the full potential, and how good did I do at analyzing the actual crude slate of the country in my video? Because I want to know what the reality is about Venezuela's true potential once we get everything right.
Well, again, thanks for having me here today. And I really loved your video. It's one of those things where I wish I would have thought it myself, and maybe throw in some Canadian maple syrup in there at some point too to have a world market.
I'm ready for a collaboration, so you come back over.
There we go. So look, I think I agree with pretty much all the things that Gustav and the other panelists have said. It's really thinking on the margin in terms of, like you said, get to 1.2 million barrels per day. That's going to be a relatively lighter lift. They were just at those levels not too long ago. And the marginal capital expenditure dollar to get it back up to the 2s, 2.5s, 3 millions is going to be a huge lift. Now, to your question on the overall resource base, some things that I just want to emphasize here is that the case in Venezuela, it's not an exploration problem. It's a known quantity resource. Granted, the 300 billion barrels numbers is highly contested because realistically it's been so long since that number has been audited. There are some questions as to what the real number is, but it's nonetheless a very vast quantity of reserves. And just like customers want diversification in terms of where they supply their crude oil, oil companies involved in upstream production want diversification. The international oil companies do on their asset bases too. So yes, in the long run, if the conditions are right, the resources there, oil companies could potentially be interested because it is another diverse source for their reserves. Again, the challenges of stabilization, of really the humanitarian crises in the country and overall governance, we're still in extremely early days. As you said, we're 3 weeks. The umpire has just said play ball. We're not even really at the first pitch yet. So to think about what's going to happen in inning number 4, right, after you get those first few innings underway is going to be very challenging to get there. But it's obviously very possible. The resources there, very known problem to solve, but it is going to be expensive, and it's going to take a very, very long time to get there.
No, I appreciate that. I want to go to a political conversation, though, going from the technical to the political, which is, and I want to stick with the framing that Luisa put out there, David, stabilization, recovery, full potential for Venezuela. When Gustavo spoke about this with Jason, it made sense. It's like, yes, we need an economic recovery, and oil is a baseline for that. Where do Delcy Rodriguez and President Trump's interests align? And where do they diverge? Is there a moment where industry is the stabilizer in this conversation because there's a shared interest in Venezuela and in the United States to be able to see the economic recovery and see the potential from oil? I'm just used to considering political wins and not just economic wins. And so what's the political win for the president?
Well, I guess the political win for the president is essentially giving real validity to the energy dominance strategy and the national security strategy, where he talked about essentially asserting U.S. power in the Western Hemisphere, controlling another country's oil revenues when they're so substantial. Big win for the president. For Delcy, staying in power. Mm-hmm. And staying in power, it seems, somewhat indefinitely, because transition is third in the Rubio framework, and we're not hearing yet about power sharing. In terms of the economics, it's a little ironic, but I guess more Venezuelan production lowers consumer prices. Not so good for energy dominance in the U.S. or for reinvestment in Venezuela. $60 oil will not do a lot to give massive investment there, but it's a political win for the president in terms of prices, and it's stabilization for the Rodriguez administration, and so they get back into business and money's coming in there. The other thing, which is a little uncertain, is whether there's harmony on the revenue split. And so it may be a win for the president when he talks about Venezuelan revenues benefiting the American and the Venezuelan people. It's uncertain whether he means there's a commission or there is, some sort of percentage which is going to the U.S. or whether this is just an abstraction. That could be another way, like tariffs, where the president gets a political win from raising revenue. Not so clear this is a win for Delcy Rodriguez. And this is where I think when Luisa talks about visibility, or I would say political stability, if that's a 50-50 split, and I've heard completely unfounded rumors talking about that, that's a political stability issue for the Rodriguez administration. That is not a harmony of interest. If it's 90-10, 80-20, it's still a political issue in Venezuela as to why all that money isn't going to Venezuela for its own development. So that's where it's not, if both sides may win in terms of revenue, but I think there's a limit there. The president, at some point, as he issues the licenses, gets to withdraw the fleet. And so the $600 million a day in hemorrhaging will lose. He will have won the victory, not for democracy, but for removing Maduro. And so it's on to the next issue, I think, for the president. And the Rodriguez administration then it just has to figure out how long stabilization lasts and how long recovery lasts and when and if there's a transition.
And I don't think we have time for it today, but obviously you have the phantom of Cuba in the background right now, too, as a 2026 story, and does focus shift from Venezuela to Cuba more broadly as the year goes on.
Yeah, very likely.
Francisco, let's bring you back in from Houston here. If you could expand on what we've already heard about the new oil law that's been put forward. Really interested if you could break it down in lay terms so the broader audience watching online and virtually can appreciate why this is important and maybe what are the key elements here that are going to be critical to seeing that expansion of Venezuela's oil sector.
Sure. So what the law proposal does, and apparently they want to approve it very quickly, it basically is to put into the law some things that are already de facto the way things work out, right? So, for example, the Chevron model contract is going to be now in the law. What is the idea there? According to the current law, every foreign partner that wants to participate in Venezuela just has the option to be a minority shareholder on a JV controlled by PDVSA, and they don't have control over the cash flow or the procurement or the exports. The Chevron model allows you to do all that. So you continue to be a minority shareholder, but you control the operation, you control the procurement, and very importantly, you control the cash flow. So this is one sort of check mark. They are getting that framework into the law. And that, of course, will apply to Repsol, to Morel and Prom, and probably to other companies afterwards. Then you are also legalizing the production sharing / service contracts, which they assigned some of them in 2024, but they were not given licenses by the US. And so far, there have been only a few investments in those projects. And they have the problem, as I mentioned before, of the type of companies that have signed those deals. But basically, those allow either the JV or PDVSA itself to give this type of contracts in existing fields, typically, to recover the production with very little infrastructure investment. So that's an opportunity, for example, for the wildcatters of the US, the independent, the smaller companies, although there are a couple of them also in the Orinoco Belt. Finally, there are two other elements. They are reducing the royalty, which in Venezuela is super high. I mean, in the existing JVs, is 50% minimum effective royalty, and it's 33.3% in the law. They are allowing the government discretionarily to reduce it to 15% in the JVs and 20% in the production sharing contracts. Finally, the law, the proposal does mention private arbitration, but it doesn't state specifically that can be international. And so I think these are insufficient, but they are a sort of a start. These are the things that the Association of Petroleum Producers in Venezuela had been asking for the last decade. And so that's a step in the right direction. But I think one of the biggest concerns was mentioned by Gustavo Garcia is that, for example, the royalty, it's a complete discretion of the government to offer you a 15% royalty, but then 2 months later, they can increase it back to 33.3%. So that's not going to cut it. I think, as Luisa mentioned, you need long-term visibility of what are the rules of the game. Otherwise, what you will get are the incumbents that already are just investing their cash flow and some of the short-term, short-cycle type of investment, but you will not get more than 300,000 barrels or a little bit more without a bigger change in the institutional framework. And by the way, political legitimacy and political stability too.
Luisa, I want to get your reflections on this law as well. If there's anything that Francisco overlooked, it does strike me the royalties conversation is fascinating because that speaks explicitly to the political stability in terms of, do the Venezuelan people actually see opportunity? And of course, the arbitration, there's a history of arbitration. Is any of that international already?
So I've been in the field of emerging markets for more than 20 years, 25 years. And the history, so basically when you have been in the financial sector covering emerging markets, that's pretty much you're covering crisis after crisis. And so, and what that tells me is that when a country develops a reputation for violation of contracts and the lack of and discretionary actions, then the threshold becomes even bigger. And so it's the concept of risk premium. And so that political stability that we're talking about, that lack of visibility, that has a price. And it gets priced in a contract in terms of what would it take for you to commit resources? And so that to me is part of the cost of producing in Venezuela. It just gets incorporated in the way you think about the returns you need to get. And so you don't, in order for you to commit significant amounts of capital, therefore, you need substantial guarantees and substantial returns because the risk of, again, expropriations and contract and violations of contracts, particularly if there's discretionary, I mean, other places can maybe pull that off. Venezuela cannot. And so when you have gone into that route, in order to lure investors back, you actually have to go almost like in the other direction. And so there's a history of that happens in elections, that the markets do not give then the president that won the election on a leftist type of platform the benefit of the doubt. You actually have to be even more responsible fiscally. So there's something about how your history, the history of how you have treated investors, gets pulled into the cost of producing in the country. So that's, I think, just a very practical way of how business work. So you are allocating capital, you have your board of directors, and so the board of directors are going to say, you what? You're going to Venezuela? Okay, so that terms have to be, it's just a fiduciary responsibility. There is capital investments that you're making. You need to make sure that you are at least going to get compensated for the risk that you're taking. So that's when you talk about political stability, when we talk about visibility, these are not just ethereal concepts. They actually have a material, economic, and financial consequence.
I want to stick with you for just one quick follow-up question, which is we've talked about the political outlook from the side of DC, also from Delcy Rodriguez's government. We have Gustavo here. Your advice for the opposition in terms of its engagement on these issues, how can it be most effective at seeing that stability move into recovery, move into full economic opportunity for the people of Venezuela?
So what I would say is that it is right, it's just 3 weeks into this. And I actually do understand the framework. It seems like, okay, this makes sense, stability, recovery, and transition. Life and things just happen in a way that this sequencing, in order to occur like that, you need to think from the beginning about the whole picture. Otherwise, you're not into that path. And so what I would suggest, or what would be fantastic, is to see intentionality in the way you think about the stabilization, even though you cannot think. I completely understand the stabilization part. Even there, you have to think intentionally about the next phases so that you are into a path that doesn't get you away from it, but continues building slowly if it needed, but continues building into the ultimate goal.
That's great advice. Thank you to Kate online here, who's asked our first virtual question I want to bring in. And I'd love to see a raise of hands if you have a question. Love to get the audience involved as well. This one's going to go to you, Jeff. It has to do with another facet, a couple facets of the business outlook in Venezuela. I want to key in on the second portion in particular, where Kate points out that Secretary Wright, the Secretary of Energy here in Washington, said today that the U.S. will not provide security for oil companies in Venezuela. I don't have the veracity behind that exact term, but it's not surprising that security itself is coming up here as a key variable for industry. Industry has a pretty broad aperture and will to go into some pretty austere environments, the oil and gas sector does. What does security look like, and what keeps that safety at the forefront for companies going into Venezuela?
Well, it's difficult because every situation is a beautiful and unique snowflake. So oil companies, yes, they have been known to go into places of the world that are dangerous, but one of the things I've learned at API is that safety culture is paramount. Our CEO has been on television discussing that safety for employees of these oil companies is absolutely imperative. And that's going to be really priority number one. So if the US government will or will not provide security, that's neither here nor there. Oil companies themselves are going to have to work with the Venezuelan government, however that emerges here in the coming months, and begin those conversations to ensure that if they choose to go and operate in the country and invest in the country, that they're going to be well protected. And they're going to have to set up the ground rules And of course, certainty is very, very important. So it's really neither here nor there in terms of the U.S. government's role. It's really going to be up to the Venezuela government and how they operate.
David, who's on the ground in Venezuela to provide that security? You have the Minister of Interior, you have the long history of PDVSA being intertwined with the military. What does security look like from your engagements with the industry as well?
Not good. I mean, you've got multiple levels of militarization in Venezuela. You have colectivos, you have the military, you have the Cubans, all of whom are still there. And so this is the problem. This is the problem with going in, is if you've got a bankrupt partner in PDVSA and you're operating a framework and you're relying on the existing government which expropriated you for physical security, and that government gets disadvantaged in a political conversation, there goes your security. And your ability to provide your own perimeter force, your own forces there in a place like Venezuela is pretty limited. So I think that's why you're hearing, from the C-suite, the need for macro-level political stability and visibility, and that means some way of dealing with the opposition and political transition. There isn't, relying on the government, multiple levels of security is not the kind of security I think that large-scale operators are looking for.
I know we're over 4 o'clock, but I do want to take an audience question. We started a little bit late, so I have a lot of audience questions, so maybe we can do a couple here. If I could get a mic up front. We have 2 up front.
Thank you very much for the very insightful panel remarks. My name is Liliana Diaz, and I am a student of Latin American energy. My question is about natural gas, because it seems it has been relegated to the second grade in Venezuela, and it is a huge potential. And without natural gas, you don't have electricity. Without electricity, you cannot resume production to the levels that Venezuela should be producing. So my question is, what about the gas, and what can be done given that 80% of the gas is associated to oil? And second, there are huge opportunities to export via Trinidad, and nobody seems to be talking about that.
Well, Francisco, I saw you nodding your head about the gas. Maybe you can jump in on your side.
Sure. So as she pointed out, yes, there are tremendous opportunities. You have, first you have this very large, very significant project, E&I Repsol project in the Paraguaná Peninsula that is already producing, and it could produce more. Perhaps it could export some gas to Colombia. The problem so far is that they were not being paid, and only occasionally they have been allowed to be paid by swaps, etc. And so that's one issue. Then you have on the other side of the country, next to Trinidad, you in particular have 2 projects that already have asked for a license. The Dragon project from Shell, which is very close to their platform Hibiscus on the Trinidadian side. They only need to connect it with a short pipeline, and of course they need to do some of the development of the field on the Venezuelan side. But from a perspective of political risk, is very attractive because you can only monetize it through Trinidad, and as a result, if the Venezuelan government changes the deal, basically they're shooting themselves in the foot. Similarly, BP has a unified field that across the border, it's much smaller than the other one, than Dragon. Coquina Manaquin, that's another opportunity. And then finally, as was mentioned, most of Venezuela's gas is associated, and it's a lot. There is a massive amount of flaring and venting, and that with not that much of a significant investment can be significantly reduced and be able to monetize that gas. That requires elimination of energy subsidies in Venezuela, but there is a lot of potential in gas. Nevertheless, not the same potential in terms of generation of revenues for the government and for rebuilding the Venezuelan economy.
No, but it does tie to another aspect of just the broader political stability and economic stability and the power side too, and maybe that's a future ALAC GEC collaboration as we deep dive the power and gas infrastructure of Venezuela. We have time for just a couple more questions. I have 2 over here. If we can do them very quickly, we can have 2 questions back to back.
Very quickly, Marco Margheriti with Eni, and thanks, Francisco, for reminding us that natural gas productions have to be economically sustainable, and they can be also made more sustainable from an environmental standpoint if we act on flaring. But the economic sustainability of the natural gas productions is essential to stabilizing the country. A question on, you spoke, thank you very much, on Venezuela's political stability. But what is the political stability of the approach on Venezuela here in the US? That is, how do you see opinions across the aisle on, at this point in time, maintaining a US approach steady and governed over time?
Political stability here in Washington, and go ahead and pass the mic back. We'll grab one more question.
Venezuela.
On Venezuela.
So James Bosworth, Latin America Risk Report. Question here is, I hear a lot of optimism about if Venezuela does all of these things, it can get back to 3 million barrels a day. And that seems to be status quo is most likely in 10 years, you will all be sitting on a stage talking about Venezuela producing 1 million barrels a day. Am I wrong? Is status quo the most likely scenario moving forward?
So 2 questions. Let's tackle the, I actually think the status quo and the actual production, I'll save that as a lightning round on where we see Venezuelan oil in 1 year and 5 years at the end. So everybody get that in the back of their minds. Who wants to jump on? David, Luisa, what do you think about the political stability in Washington on the topic of Venezuela?
I'm happy to go first on that one. I think Venezuela is not popular, I think, with the MAGA base. And because of the expense, because of the risk. Democrats are certainly strongly opposed to it, and today's Washington, none of that really matters. And so after midterm elections, would it matter, if the Democrats take the House and you have oversight? Maybe, maybe not. So I think we're in a political atmosphere right now where what Congress thinks about foreign policy doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. Certainly it doesn't really matter a whole lot on the Republican Senate side. Because they voted down War Powers resolutions, which suggested that the president's power ought to be constrained. And so I think that's where we are. The popularity of it doesn't really matter. And so I think the real question on the stability of the policy is the attention span of the president on this issue. And I think, as Landon alluded earlier, there are other issues which could pop up which might take his attention. Cuba, likely, I would say, in the first half of this year. And then the question of who manages Venezuela falls to Marco Rubio, and how sustainable a massive level of intervention in the economy is, I think, is unlikely.
Although I will add, it is pretty amazing to have 2 leads of the State Department being Western Hemisphere experts, right? You're used to having a European transnational or transatlanticist or somebody else being in those positions. So you do have strong attention in the State Department,
Deputy
at least.
Secretary Lando, former
Correct.
ambassador, and yeah.
Luisa, did you have any thoughts on that? The political stability?
No.
Okay. Well, then we'll go to this lightning round that I teed you up on, and I want to have each of your opinions. Maybe Francisco, we'll start with you. Where do you see Venezuela's oil in 1 year, and where do you see it in 2030? What's production looking like?
I think in the short run, you will see basically Chevron and Repsol. So you are talking about 1.2, at the most 1.3 million barrels. I think by the end of the year, most likely 1.2. And then, of course, in the long run, it's completely contingent on if there is, to me, a political transition to a stable democracy or not. If not, I think at the maximum you will get 1.5 million barrels, and then a stagnation and even potentially decline, and maybe you get to the point that James was mentioning. If on the other hand you have a political transition, I am not as optimistic that you could get to 4 million barrels, because I know the history of the region of lots of political obstacles, but at least I think it's very feasible to get to between 2.6 and 3 million barrels.
In 2030?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to clock that at 1.25 with the upward mobility to 3, basically here. David?
I would say I agree on the short term, another 300,000 barrels or so by the end of the year. I would be flabbergasted if by 2030 Venezuela even reached 2 million barrels a day. I think 2 million.
Oh, okay.
2 million, even 2 million. I think I would be flabbergasted.
Luisa?
I think it's very difficult to have this discussion without having a clear outlook of what the oil price looks like. It is a very different discussion if oil prices are at this level or even lower than if oil prices are much higher. So I just think it depends because it's so I would maintain that to me, it feels like the capacity where there can be a recovery, if nothing else changes on the politics, is 1.5. Other than that, I think you need massive changes.
Jeff?
I gave up a while ago because 20 years ago, people were worried about peak oil, and United States crude oil production was in terminal decline. And look where we are now. So it really depends on the state of the future global demand. If the demand's there, really anything's possible. But for now, long term, it's going to be an uphill battle, but nothing's impossible. The word itself says, I'm possible.
I'm not meaning to be bearish. I'm going to go with 1.15 to 1.5, next 1 year and 2030. So we'll see how we land. Thank you, everybody that joined us in the audience for this really lively conversation. To our panelists, thank you for your expertise and time here at the Atlantic Council. We look forward to many more discussions on Venezuela and the energy space in Latin America more broadly. So look forward to you joining us in the future, and really grateful for your time today. Thank you.